The dream of post-financial independence is living a simple life, maybe living on a beach somewhere, working when you need some money, but not worrying about saving or planning for the future. It's a dream that I've personally had ever since I was a kid. But a couple years ago, I achieved post-financial independence. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about how I achieved post-financial independence and how you can too, as well as what the actual benefits are for achieving financial independence. And hopefully I can give some perspective both on the general benefits from reaching post-fi, as well as a more personal perspective from having lived as post-fi for well over 24 months at this point. So hey everyone, and welcome to FinTech. Hit the like button if you want. And let's start out by just talking generally about what financial independence is. Fundamentally, financial independence is the dream of anyone who works a really demanding job or just hates being told what to do every day by a boss. Or even someone who just sits there down on a Sunday afternoon because they know the next day they have to wake up early and go to work. Financial independence is not needing to work a job you hate in order to make money. The most common form of financial independence that's commonly talked about is F.I.R.E, or Financial Independence Retire Early. The goal of this movement is to essentially save as much money as possible as quickly as possible so that you can retire as young as possible. Many followers of this practice will save 50, 60, 70% of their income every year just so that they can move their F.I.R.E date closer and closer to the current day. I recently ran into a community online called the Overemployed community, where there's people who will actually work 2 full-time jobs at the same time, usually remote jobs, with the goal of basically earning twice as much money. And this really ties in with financial independence because the more money you can make and save, the quicker you can reach that early retirement goal. With this method, you really sacrifice your time and effort while you're young with the goal of reaching retirement by your late 30s or even early 40s. Way ahead of when previous generations even thought possible. But while that method may work for some, for others it's a little too extreme to imagine sacrificing 15 to 20 years of their life working as hard as possible just so that they can move up their retirement date by 20 years. So that's why we're going to talk about a different way to achieve effectively the same goal but with much less upfront time and effort. And that is where coasting financial independence comes in. Coasting financial independence, also known as Coast-Fi or Barista-Fi, is fundamentally when you have enough money invested in the stock market so that by the time you need to retire, it can grow into a large enough amount for you to live off of. Now, the benefits to this aren't quite as clear on the surface as something like F.I.R.E, which might seem a little bit sexier at first. But in reality, coasting financial independence is extremely powerful. Think about it. Once you know that your financial future is secured, the only money that you need to earn on a day-to-day basis is whatever it takes for you to live off of. This opens up a whole bunch of opportunities for you. For example, you could go somewhere like a different country with a much lower cost of living, then just work part-time online, and because the cost of living is so low, you wouldn't need to earn as much or work as hard to make a living. You can also go and live a completely free life that might be considered irresponsible normally, like maybe work as a ski instructor in the mountains or teach surfing on the beach, and just make a little bit of money, but enough for you to live off of. And you know that you are being financially responsible because your future is already secured. Really, you can do whatever you want. But the point is, you don't have to work a high-income, high-stress job in order to secure your future. You can instead focus on doing whatever gives you the most self-fulfillment, but with one drawback, and that's the fact that you do need to keep working. The only thing is, I'm not so sure that that's a drawback. I'm really into personal finance, and I've watched tons of YouTube videos, read blogs and books on it, as well as read a bunch of forum posts from people who have reached full financial independence retire early. One commonality I see between a lot of these people who are retiring in their late 30s is they'll retire, but only for 6 or 7 months. And then they'll quickly get bored and go and work some other job that maybe pays a little bit less, but is much less stress than what they did before. But wait a minute, that's just Coast-Fi with extra steps. While a lot of people may think that the goal of retiring early is really what they want, I think that in reality, most people do like to work in some fashion. It gives them self-fulfillment. They just don't want to work a job that they hate. So by achieving Coast-Fi, you can get all the same benefits that you would get from retiring early, but without needing to save for 15 or 20 years and only needing to save up enough to retire at some point in the future when you're too old to keep working. But I told you that I reached Coast-Fi almost 2 years ago at this point. So number one, how did I do it so quickly? And number two, how do I even know that I've reached Coast-Fi? Well, as far as how I did it, I'm currently 26 years old and I graduated from college around 4 years ago. I've saved more than half my income during that time. I invested a lot of it into real estate and then the rest of it all went into the stock market. And I've had some pretty lucky picks in the stock market that have made my net worth grow really quickly. So even though I'm relatively young, the fact that I'm young actually gives me an advantage in Coast.Fi because I can leave my money growing in the market for 40 years essentially before I need it to actually retire in old age. Now, as far as how I know what my actual Coast.Fi number is and how you can calculate your own number for yourself, the first thing you need to do is look at what your monthly expenses are. Now, we're going to make the assumption here that whatever you spend in the future is roughly the same as your expenses today, but you can adjust these numbers based on what you think you're going to spend in old age, but don't account for inflation quite yet. We can then use the 4% rule as laid out by William Bengen, which essentially says that you can withdraw 4% of your total investments every year in retirement without ever running out of money. So even though you pull out that 4% from your accounts every year, all the extra interest that you gain from your investments is enough to cover that difference, essentially letting you retire forever. So for me personally, my monthly expenses come out to a total of around $3,000 per month, or the equivalent of $36,000 per year. Now, just to make the math a little bit simpler and just to be safe with the numbers, let's say that I spend $40,000 per year. Well, using the 4% rule, if I take $40,000 and divide that by 0.04, that comes out to exactly $1 million. So again, ignoring inflation for now, by age 65, I'm going to need at least $1 million in the stock market making me money. From there, we can work backward to today. So how much money do I need invested right now for it to grow into $1 million by age 65? Well, we can use a compound interest calculator to handle this for us. So let's say I had $100,000 today, and then I don't invest any more money into the market, and then that gains around the 9 to 10% interest rate that the market has historically returned on average. Well, after 40 years, I would have over $3 million invested in the stock market. But now we do have to account for inflation. So let's drop that 9% return per year down to 7% to account for the amount of money that we're losing to inflation every year. So in that case, after 40 years, I would still have $1.5 million in my account by age 65, which is more than I need. It turns out I actually need around $70,000 actively invested in the market at my age in order to have about $1 million by the time I reach 65. I can do this by putting all that money into a Roth IRA or a Roth 401k so that I don't have to worry about taxes on the amount as it grows, and when I actually pull that money out when I'm old enough, I don't have to pay taxes on it, and 100% of that money can go toward my expenses. So that number, $70,000, is so much more achievable than $1 million right now. And that's the difference between pursuing Coast.Fi and pursuing F.I.R.E. And because that number is so much lower, that's how I was able to achieve it so quickly on admittedly an above average income. And if you want to see in more detail the process that I followed in order to build up that nest egg, you can see it in my video on my plan to become a millionaire by age 35. But for anyone who watches my channel regularly, you might be asking, okay, you reached Coast.Fi, but how come you keep on working the same job, you still live in the same place, and your lifestyle doesn't really seem to have changed? So there's two answers to that. Number one, the reason I still work the same job is because I still enjoy what I do. I'm not working a job that I hate or forcing myself to go into work every single day. The work is generally pretty enjoyable. Now, if it wasn't enjoyable, I would have the option to go do something else, but at this point, I don't need to do that. But that answer is a little bit of a cop-out because it doesn't answer the fact about why I'm still saving an even greater percentage of my income today than I was 2 years ago. Since I first reached Ko-Fi, my income has gone up as I've gotten raises over time, and yet I still save an even greater percentage of my overall income than I did before. So chances are most of the money that I'm saving and investing right now, I'm not ever going to touch in my lifetime. So why not use it today? Well, I don't really have a great mathematical answer to that. I think the numbers do kind of show that I should just be spending that money today. But that's kind of where we run into the limits of what personal finance can tell us, because I really think the explanation here is a little bit more psychological in nature. And it all ties back to this concept called the Hedonic Treadmill. The Hedonic Treadmill is the idea that with humans, we naturally adapt to change over time. So let's say one day I go out and I buy a $1 burger, and I really enjoy that burger. So I keep on doing that for a couple weeks, but after doing that regularly, I don't really enjoy it as much anymore. So instead of doing that, I go out and buy a $20 sushi roll instead. And I really enjoy that sushi roll, but then I do that for a couple weeks, and that kind of gets old too. So then I go out and buy a $20,000 car instead. Then I go out and buy a really expensive house or expensive boat. You can keep on spending money on nicer and nicer things or better and better experiences, but eventually you will settle down to a baseline level of happiness. And that's why it's called the hedonic treadmill, because as much as you pursue hedonism and things that make you feel better over time, it's not going to be sustainable. Eventually, you're going to fall back to your baseline. There's a really interesting YouTube channel by Justin Kan, who's one of the founders of Twitch, and he talks about this concept for himself. Now, he obviously has way more money than I do. He has multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, but he talks about how once you reach a certain level of wealth, you're not really gaining any additional benefit by spending it. In fact, he breaks it down into 3 basic levels of wealth. The lowest level is where you're basically struggling to meet your needs, and this is probably where most people fall. After that is the level where you can basically go out to any restaurant and eat anything you want. And then the highest level of wealth is being able to go on any vacation you want. But there's really nothing else to spend the money on after that point. So that begs the question of why do people like Justin Kan or Jeff Bezos continue to work even though they've already reached as much wealth as they could ever need in their lifetime? And the only answer as to why is because they enjoy working, and that's what they want to do with their time. So whether your goal is FIRE or Coast-Fi or something else entirely, chances are you're going to want to do some kind of fulfilling work in your life. So rather than only focusing on maximizing your personal finance goals, instead, maybe figure out what kind of life you want to live and then align your personal finance goals to support that lifestyle. And once you start doing something that you really want to do, you might ironically end up being more successful and making more money than you would have anyway. Right now I'm reading Richard Branson's autobiography. He's the billionaire founder of companies like Virgin Music Group and Virgin Galactic. And he talks about in his autobiography that the types of businesses he got involved with were businesses that he thought would be fun. Yes, he was obviously an extremely savvy businessman, but he also loved what he did, which allowed him to put his whole self into the companies that he created. I know it's kind of a dumb cliche that if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, but maybe we could just change that to do what you find fulfilling and forget about the rest. One really interesting idea that you can also tie in with Coast-Fi is one that was brought up by Tim Ferriss in his book, The 4-Hour Workweek. Tim Ferriss brings up the idea of taking mini 6-month vacations every 4 to 5 years. Remember how I brought up earlier that once people actually retire, they usually only want to do it for like 5 to 7 months before they get bored and want to go back to work. So instead of waiting until you're fully retired, why not take a mini retirement every 4 to 5 years? That way you're actually young enough to enjoy your retirement and everything that comes with it, and at the same time you don't have to save up a ton of money for some giant retirement at some distant date in the future. So here's an exercise that I would encourage you to do. Write out what your ideal life would look like. And you can write this out in different ways. You could picture it as what a day in your life would look like. You could picture it as what kind of work you're doing. But just figure out what your aspirational life would be. Then work backward to figure out what your personal finance goals need to be to achieve that life. Chances are, once you have enough money saved up that your retirement at old age is handled, it becomes a lot easier to focus on what is actually important. That is the real power of coasting financial independence. It's giving you true financial freedom today. But let me know in the comments what you think of coasting financial independence and how close you are to achieving your own personal finance goals. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.